enough years and I was studying Egyptian archaeology, and we're, learning hieroglyphs and all the rest. And I was reading the afterlife texts, like the pyramid texts, coffin texts, the Book of the Dead, which came later. And I just started noticing how there were these similarities between near-death experiences and the beliefs I was reading about, the descriptions of the journey to the other world. Once you strip back the kind of cultural overlay, there was, leaving the body, entering into darkness, coming into this other realm, which was often a realm of bright light, meeting a being of light, which was the sun god Re in the Egyptian case, um, meeting your deceased relatives, having some kind of review or judgment of your previous life, and then the way you progress into the next stage of the other world is kind of dependent on your previous actions.
Hello, and welcome to the Spirit Box podcast, where we explore folklore, magic, the world of the spirits, and everything in between. In today's episode, I'm joined by Dr. Gregory Shushan, a pioneering researcher on near-death experiences, or NDEs. He has spent over 25 years studying historical accounts of NDEs, uncovering their profound influence on religious beliefs, mythologies, and cultural understandings of the afterlife. His research, as explored in his book, Near-Death Experiences in the Ancient Civilisations, The Origins of the World's Afterlife Beliefs, reveals striking parallels between modern NDEs and accounts from historical cultures, shedding light on how early societies interpreted these extraordinary events. In the show, we explore what ancient texts reveal about encounters with the dead, the journey of the soul, and how different civilizations from Egypt and Mesopotamia to India and Mesoamerica understood these experiences. Gregory shares fascinating insights into how NDEs may have shaped early ideas on judgment, reincarnation, and the soul's transition into the next world. His work also investigates the connections between NDEs, shamanism, initiation rites, and visions of the otherworld, questioning whether these universal phenomena influence the development of religious traditions across cultures. In the Plus show, we take a deeper dive into Gregory's upcoming research on Greek and Roman NDEs, as well as lesser-known accounts from Indigenous First Nations traditions that challenge modern assumptions about the afterlife. Beyond ancient civilizations, we also examine connections between NDEs and folklore, particularly Irish fairy folklore, where people are said to vanish into the other world and return transformed. Themes that will be very familiar to followers of this show. We also discuss how these stories might reflect ancient beliefs about crossing the threshold between life and death, and how different cultures interpreted the journey between worlds. If you want to hear the Plus show, the simplest thing to do is to click the Linktree links below, come and join the Patreon, and you will get 5 years worth of Plus shows and bonus shows, and including the Nameless podcast, which Tommy Kelly and I have just started, which is only available on our respective Patreons. But if that isn't your thing, then you can always help support the show by picking up a copy of my book, Song of the Dark Man, Father of Witches, Lord of the Crossroads. Okay, that's it for me. Let's get on with the show. Dr. Gregory Shushan, you are most welcome to the Spirit Box.
Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
Great stuff. Great stuff. To help orientate people to what today's show is going to be about, could you tell them a little bit about yourself and about your new work that we'll be discussing today?
Sure, yeah. I am a historian of religions, and I actually started out in archaeology, specifically Eastern Mediterranean and then Egyptian archaeology. And then I sort of defected to the study of religions, um, mostly because uh, I started being more attracted to the texts rather than the material culture. And I could have stayed in Egyptology, for example, and focused more on texts, but I also wanted to do cross-cultural comparison, and I wasn't sure I wanted to stay researching one particular civilization for the rest of my life, basically. So this idea of looking at cross-cultural afterlife beliefs in the context of near-death experiences, which is the subject of the new book, Near-Death Experience in Ancient Civilisations, that was a way of kind of branching out and looking at ancient civilizations, but also really kind of zeroing in on these cross-cultural accounts and the possibility that near-death experiences could have influenced afterlife beliefs around the world.
It's a fascinating construct, and the book is really detailed in how you kind of go through the various different civilizations. Um, it must be a hell of a lot of research. You know, when kind of when your publisher first reached out to me, and kind of outlined the proposition, I was like, would you be interested? And I was like, oh yes, definitely, most definitely. This is so interesting. Um, and what kind of what sparked your interest in this area? It sounds like you've got quite a kind of traditional academic background.
Yeah, yeah. I didn't plan on becoming like a near-death studies researcher, and I actually don't really consider myself in that field. I'm not the same as somebody like Bruce Grayson or Kenneth Ring, right? And even less so Sam Parnia or these kind of super scientific, empirical science focused people. Um, but I did, as a kid, going way back, I had an interest in, strange phenomena. I had all these books about that sort of thing. I had an aunt who was a Rosicrucian, and she would give me books about, strange books by Lobsang Rampa and all these kinds of spiritual, mystical things. My mom was kind of the hippie era. She wrote her master's thesis on William Blake and the psychedelic experience. So, and she kind of exposed us to Buddhism and Hinduism. And I had a Catholic grandmother, I had a Jewish father. So I was kind of raised almost to be a historian of religions. But I never
Right.
kind of followed any of them. So I wasn't actually
Sure.
raised religious. I was raised exposed to all of them. And I always kind of had to me, it was always from the point of view of, well, isn't it strange that people believe these things? And in
Mm,
my mind, it was
mm.
almost the same as the books about strange phenomena. It was
Yeah,
almost
yeah, yeah.
like this is all these weird things going out in the world. And
Mm,
so, but when I learned about near-death experiences the first time, I kind of thought, okay, now that seems particularly interesting,
mhm.
um, because it seems like the claims are people are clinically dead for a time and they come back and talk about these experiences,
Yeah.
and the reports about them are supposed to be similar and all that. So that really kind of sparked my imagination. And then I stumbled on a book by Carol Zaleski called Otherworld Journeys, and she compared medieval Christian European afterlife journey texts about monks and nuns with contemporary near-death experiences. And so fast forward a number of years, and I was studying Egyptian archaeology, and we're learning hieroglyphs and all the rest. And I was reading the afterlife texts, like the pyramid texts, coffin texts, the Book of the Dead, which came later. And I just started noticing how there were these similarities between near-death experiences and the beliefs I was reading about, the descriptions of the journey to the other world. Once you strip back the kind of cultural overlay, there was, leaving the body, entering into darkness, coming into this other realm, which was often a realm of bright light, meeting a being of light, which was the sun god Re in the Egyptian case, um, meeting your deceased relatives, having some kind of review or judgment of your previous life, and then the way you progress into the next stage of the other world is kind of dependent on your previous actions, and also encountering the corpse, which I thought was a really interesting cross-cultural concept. But in fact, that's a good way to describe symbolically how I was analyzing these texts. So the deceased as he travels to the underworld, he encounters the god Osiris, and Osiris is the god of the dead, the judge. And it's his corpse that's in this kind of dark, hidden space of the underworld. But repeatedly, the soul of the dead is associated with Osiris, basically saying, "You have become Osiris. You are one with Osiris." So perceiving that corpse of Osiris from outside of that perspective, I think that was a symbolic expression of that out of body experience moment when you see your own corpse. And in fact, it has the exact same meaning in that text as it does for people who have near death experiences, which is realizing that you're dead, realizing that you've transcended death, and that you're still this conscious, awake, functioning individual.
And so that's kind of what prompted you to write the book. Um, Fascinating. And you've got, is it three civilizations that you kind of,
Actually, it's Egypt before the New Kingdom, so Middle Kingdom
yeah.
and Old Kingdom. Mesopotamia, mostly Sumer and some Old Babylonian. China before Buddhism, India before Buddhism and before kind of Hinduism proper,
Mm.
called the Vedic period, and then in Mesoamerica, the two civilizations of the Aztec and the Maya.
Right. Okay.
So,
Um,
and the reason I chose them was because they kind of all emerged organically from within their own geographic regions, not totally independently. There was trade between Egypt and Mesopotamia and whatever else, and even between Mesopotamia and India. But there wasn't, it's not like religions and traditions and gods and myths were
mhm.
shared between them. So I wanted
Yeah.
to kind of eliminate the idea that it was one story originating in one place and then fanning out to the rest of the world.
Uh, yeah. That was like an absolute conscious decision to kind of make that segmentation.
Yeah,
Do you,
yeah,
I mean, like when we're kind of in this, I guess, like slightly slipstream, paranormal, alternative history type culture, um, would you have you had much challenge to the idea of these were no contact civilizations? I can imagine that you'd probably get some maybe reasonably cohesive arguments and some kind of off the wall ones. I'm sure you can
yeah,
kind of manage those requests, but
yeah.
or those inquiries rather. But it the fact that these are distinct and separate was that quite important to the thesis.
Yeah, yeah. It was because, just to give a couple of examples, if I had looked at Greece and Rome,
Yeah,
Greece and Rome emerged from, a civilization in the ancient
sure.
world with lots of influence from Egypt, and um, so I was just trying to minimize that whole idea. But from a kind of academic standpoint, there really hasn't been much challenge, and I think that's because I was careful to say, I'm not saying that there's no contact whatsoever, and
Hmm.
there's this idea that the concept of writing may have entered Egypt from ancient Sumer. I kind of personally doubt that. I think it was independent,
Right.
but I'm willing to entertain that possibility. There's a mention of a god from Byblos in the coffin text, or maybe even the pyramid text. There's often, obviously some connection between some of them. But then the further you go, the less possible that is. So, for example, there was no possibility of Egyptian influence on the Mesoamerican cultures, not only chronologically, but distance and everything else,
Hmm.
or on China or on India.
Yeah.
So the only kind of way you could postulate any kind of diffusion argument, which is what they call it
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
anthropology, would be, you know, Egypt to Sumer to India to China uh, to Mesoamerica, but it's totally speculative and unproven.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. That's quite a game of hopscotch.
yeah,
Yeah.
but it just didn't happen. There's no evidence for it is the thing,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Fair enough.
like coming from archaeology, everything is evidence based.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
that's why we need to justify everything basically.
And kind of circling back around, so you kind of you laid out that when you were a child or growing up, you had these familial influences, these kind of books around the house, and kind of, I guess, a fairly open and inquiring, family um, kind of circle, which is fabulous, isn't it? To give you that kind of platform and a spread of ideas at a young age. But for you, kind of personally, in this area of like near death, I mean, it's a super interesting topic. What is there like you know a, a moment, like a personal experience of an associate or of someone in your circle that triggered this? Because it's quite a specific interest.
Yeah, there wasn't actually no. I mean, I'd had my own experiences with psychedelics and
Right.
meditation and
Yeah.
things like that. So, but I never even thought about them in terms of death
Right.
or afterlife or anything like that. It really was. It just started as an academic question, and also just
Okay.
kind of
Yeah.
revisiting
Yeah.
those kinds of my interest in those kind of phenomena and thinking, wow, this is an interesting way to bring this together.
Sure. Sure.
And then I was surprised. I thought it was totally original. I had no idea that anybody had done this kind of work before. And the more I dug into it, the more I found that there's been this kind of undercurrent in the history of religions going back to the 19th century. So even E.B. Tyler, famous anthropologist,
Right.
I think in his book Primitive Religion, he wrote something like, there are stories around the world of men who claim to temporarily die and return to their bodies and tell what they saw in the other world. And it may be that their beliefs are based on these experiences. So it's like two sentences in a
Mm.
book from 1871, and then it's forgotten for another 50 years. And then another one would kind of independently come up with the same idea. And yeah, that's been happening essentially the whole time. There's a new example. There's an excellent scholar at Hebrew University, Ulia Ustinova, and it's the exact same thing. I was reading
Right.
her books on caves in ancient Greece and ecstatic experience in ancient Greece, and she had no idea that this was work that was going on in other fields in other parts of the world. But she
Fascinating.
came to the exact same conclusions about
Oh,
the
wow.
relationship with NDEs.
Oh,
So,
that's really interesting. I found actually reading through the kind of the like the Egyptian um story of the kind of the afterlife experience was was like it sounded like a DMT trip. Like it was so kind of like intense and varied, and you're meeting all these different beings. Um, you know, when you were going through that and kind of reading through the source material, like what was kind of jumping out to you, like about it, and what was the kind of the striking material? Because I mean, it's I guess you can say about any kind of like near death experience, it's an extraordinary thing. But the ones that I'm kind of familiar with, and it's not an area of huge knowledge for me, but the ones that I'm kind of like colloquially familiar with from kind of from pop culture are, as you described, kind of seeing the body, the kind of the tunnel of light, the darkness, and the meeting of deceased relatives, and then given that kind of I'm in Western Europe, the ones that I've kind of read about will have some sort of Christian bent to them, you know.
mm,
But reading through that versus kind of like the Egyptian model, you're like, Jesus, like this is like it's so different, and
yeah,
like and so vivid and kind of visceral.
yeah, yeah. I really wanted to make sure I was really careful to not read into the text things I wanted to see that matched up with NDEs.
Gotcha.
So in order to avoid that, in the book, as you'll have seen in all of the civilizations, in fact, I describe the afterlife as found in these texts,
Hmm.
um, and then I kind of highlight what about them is analogous to an NDE,
Yeah.
because I wanted to give like the full picture to not
Yeah.
not do the cherry picking
Yeah.
bad methodology thing. So and so it was kind of a two pronged thing. One was figuring out if there were those similarities with NDEs, and if they were consistent enough to be able to say it's likely that the beliefs were founded on an NDE, but then also what was different about them. What are the key differences, and how can those be explained?
Mm-hmm.
The differences are much more difficult to be explained, especially in a civilization like ancient Egypt, because there's still a lot that isn't known. So, just to give one example, something that's very much unlike an NDE in Egypt was the idea of the soul of the dead joining the sun god Re on his celestial boat. And on this boat, they sail together through the heavens, through the waters of the heavens, and all these different kinds of regions of that world. And then going all the way back down into the undersky, as they called it, where that's the realm of Osiris. And they have to kind of overcome a number of challenges on their way. And then they come up the other side and go through it again. And it's portrayed as this eternal circuit through the celestial realms and through the underrealms. Um, and that's obviously not something that's characteristic
Mm-hmm.
of NDEs.
Mm-hmm.
And so earlier scholars would suggest things like it might have been that that version of the afterlife came from one region of Egypt, north or south, and the other version that's more like the NDE that I described could be from the other region, and that they merged in the text, but without a kind of reconciling description of why they're different and what's going on.
Right.
Um, That might be the case, but I also wonder if it's symbolically alluding to this idea of transcendence and omnipresence, that you've kind of so over any kind of earthly connection or earthly boundaries that you're, associated with every divine element. And the texts actually say this. They associate the soul of the dead with Re and Osiris and Sekhmet and Sia, just like basically every deity, male or female, with transcendent concepts, the cosmos, and everything else. So that's one way of looking at it, anyway.
Okay. And in terms of like doing the research and the methodology that you found, the methodology you pursued rather, um, what were the elements that kind of really struck you? Like for me, kind of in previous work that I've been doing, there were a few kind of key. Oh, okay, those moments where kind of the penny dropped or things took in a direction that you weren't expecting. Um, and because this is just like it's quite a big book and it's really well researched. Like you must have gone through a hell of a lot of material to pull it together. I'm just asking, really, kind of, what was that journey like for you? What did you kind of experience when you were doing it?
I mean, actually, this book was kind of like 25 years in the making, in a
Wow,
way,
wow, yeah, okay,
because it started out as a part of my MA thesis,
right.
which was at Institute of Archaeology in London. That
Oh,
was
cool.
comparing Egyptian and Vedic Indian afterlife beliefs. So that sort
Yeah.
of formed the core and allowed me to work out the research methodology. And that also involved like a whole research plan. And then it kind of expanded from there, and it was formed the subject of my PhD thesis, the
Hmm.
broader comparison, which was then published in a monograph, a very small press monograph. And then over the years, I wrote other books, and I researched NDEs and indigenous religions cross-culturally as well. Um, and I kept kind of revisiting the ancient civilizations and reassessing them in light of what I was coming across in the
Hmm.
other research. So I decided to basically rewrite it, update it by looking at new translations, new research, anything that had kind of been done that's relevant in the last 10, 15 years. And so, yeah, that's what I did. So it was a long journey. Like, for example, when I originally did the research, there was no full English translation of the Rig Veda from India.
Okay,
And
right.
so I was able to, now there has been, I think it was published in, I don't know, 2015 or 18 or something. And it's a massive 3-volume, super detailed work. So it took a long time to go through this. And initially I thought, oh, this shouldn't be too difficult, but it basically took me 2 years to rewrite this.
Wow.
And it was almost re-researching it because I had to,
Right. Okay.
again,
Yeah.
double check all the translations
Yeah.
and then also reassess it in light of the stuff I found later,
Yeah.
really.
Yeah. And did your perception of the subject, like, did it change much from when you started your journey on this?
It did, yeah, because initially when I did the research, I didn't think I would find actual accounts of near-death experiences. I thought it was just going to be comparing afterlife journey
Yeah.
beliefs to NDEs and myths and things like that. Um, but it turned out that only Egypt is the only one that didn't have actual descriptions of near-death experience,
Right.
or at least some kind of indication that they knew about them in medical texts or magical texts or whatever. Um, and that's only because I think they didn't have that context for their writing. They only used writing for bureaucracy and ritual and
Right. Okay.
kingship type royal decrees and that sort of thing. Um, but yes, in all of the other societies, I found actual accounts of NDEs. So when I was rewriting the book, I thought I need to bring that forward rather
Hmm.
than the beliefs themselves, because that's really the key issue
Yeah.
that's going on. And initially, I kind of assess, and I do it in this book too, but I kind of assess all the other kinds of theories that might account for the cross-cultural similarities. But it's more to show how either they played a role, a minor role, and that the NDEs were the most significant thing, or to discount them entirely because some of them actually just didn't work.
Right, right. Excuse me. And how do you think this book will affect kind of modern the modern kind of time frame in research into this area?
I mean, ideally, I would hope it would influence two strands of research. One is just the history of religions, because
Mm.
um, the idea that there is a type of experience that can lead to religious beliefs, a religious
Yeah.
experience, that's like a taboo subject at the moment in the history of
Right.
religions. It's
Okay.
just
Mm.
people, it's seen as crossing a boundary into theology, smuggling theology into the subjective
Yeah.
secular study of religions. And so it's not really done. Even cross-cultural comparison is kind of frowned on because of these ideas of seeing all cultures as the same,
Hmm.
which was another reason I really kind of tried to balance looking at similarities and differences,
Mm.
because that's each is as important as the other.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and then so as far as that goes, I think I hope it will also have an impact on near-death studies, because almost all of the theorizing in near-death studies has been from the perspective of a Western stereotype, which doesn't really
Mm.
exist.
Mm.
So even going back to Raymond Moody's book 50 years ago, this is the 50th anniversary this year, of Life After Life. He isolated these 15 or 17 or whatever elements of an NDE, but he very clearly said there's not a single account that he's run across that has all of them. So he
Right.
acknowledged the differences even back then. And there's been a lot of attention paid to kind of parsing that, with Bruce Grayson and the Grayson scale, which he kind of tweaked every few years. And it's valuable to kind of assess the nature of the experiences and the content of them. But I think it was also ended up limiting scholars into evaluating an NDE based on the content rather than the context. So what I mean by that is, looking at NDEs cross-culturally, I don't even consider what the content is, um, in deciding whether it's an NDE or not. For me, it's an NDE if the context is a person temporarily dies, um, comes back to life, and talks about what happened in that
Right.
period in between.
Mm.
So I'm hoping just generally that the cross-cultural differences will kind of uh, be considered a little bit more in near-death studies,
Yeah.
because there are things like, um, let's give one example. In recent claims within the scientific death studies community, you've probably seen, in the last 2 or 3 years, there have been one article after another, scientists finding that there's a burst of electrical activity in the brain at the moment of death. And there's theorizing that that's responsible for not just near-death experiences, but specifically the life review. That moment is all of the boundaries in your brain shutting down, and your consciousness is flooded with all your memories just before you switch off and
Mm.
die. The problem with that is that whole notion of a panoramic life review is a completely Western NDE theme. It just doesn't happen cross-culturally. There are evaluations of your life, and some kind of uh, yeah, determination of your, as I said earlier, determination of what's going to happen to you next based on your earthly conduct. There's one example, a Native American example, where the person having an NDE sees a photograph of himself on the wall during his experience, and that photograph somehow embodies his earthly deeds. But that's miles away from a
Mm.
panoramic life review. So so yeah, scientists just kind of need to be able to accommodate all that diversity, because that example alone,
Mm.
as well as the total absence of panoramic life reviews, challenges that dying brain theory of the life
Yeah.
review.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes an awful lot of sense. And I'm fascinated by those differences. Could you tell us more about some of those?
Yeah, another good one is the tunnel. Going back to Susan Blackmore, I think her book was 1992, about kind of debunking near-death experience. It's, even though it's as old as it is, it's still kind of the key text that people keep going back to as far as the scientific theories. Um, and she was saying, I think it was lack of oxygen leads to almost like a tunnel vision kind of effect in the dying brain. And so you have the sensation of entering a dark tunnel. Um, but again, cross-culturally, we don't have dark tunnels. There are Polynesian examples where typically they talk about walking along a path or a road to the other world, and they'll even say things like, I saw the footprints in the sand of all the spirits who had walked to the village, the spirit village before me. There's one account where a woman is walking to the spirit village, and she sees a spirit walking back the other direction, who's heading back to his body,
Oh
who had
wow.
just had an NDE, and he's about to
Wow.
wake up. Yeah. So thematically, it's the same. It's still transitioning
Mm,
from the dead body going to this other realm. But yeah, they're strolling along a sandy path, so
mm.
rather than speeding through a tunnel. And another really interesting one is, returning to the body is obviously universal. Otherwise, we wouldn't have
Yeah.
accounts of near-death experiences. But the reason for returning varies quite a bit cross-culturally. So, in the kind of contemporary Western examples that we're familiar with, it's usually a case of something unfulfilled in your personal life that you have to deal with. So you have to take care of your children or your aging parents, or you didn't, finish your PhD or your novel or whatever it is. Um, Whereas in other cultures, it's often a case of mistaken identity. So in India, a few in Japan and other places, where, say, I would go to the other world in my near-death experience, and the being of light would say, actually, there's been a clerical error. We got the wrong Gregory Shushan. We want the one who lives in upstate New York. And so I would come back to my body, having had my NDE, and this poor other Gregory Shushan in upstate New York would then die permanently.
Wow.
So again, the being sent back to the body is the same, the return is the same, but the reason for the return is obviously culturally, if
Mm,
not individually,
mhm.
determined.
That's fascinating. Um, I remember, I think it was the Holographic Universe by Michael Talbot, and
Oh,
he
right.
spoke to some NDEs in that book. I think so, if memory serves. But there was one account where it's a young lady, and she's having this kind of not necessarily the review, but the kind of the there's like an interview with a being
Hmm.
of some description and an authority.
Right.
So maybe that kind of that being of light,
Hmm.
and she's told she's died, and her immediate response is, "But I haven't danced enough yet." To which this
Oh,
being apparently found this enormously funny, and she went back.
wow.
I think it's the Holographic Universe, which is a really interesting book. Um,
Yeah.
but I love those kind of like that admin error you mentioned, like that kind of stuff. It's almost kind of more hopeful for the afterlife in a way than kind of that kind of weighing of one's heart against a feather, or the kind of
Right.
the list of one's activities in the book of life. Um, what other kind of cultural differences that really stand out?
Um, I mean, the differences are so vast, that it's kind of impossible to even summarize, at least in the
Sure,
beliefs.
sure,
But I mean, another common one is that the identity of the being of light, or
yeah,
whatever kind of spirit entity, is, very much culturally perceived
right,
or experienced. So, Christians always will often say they saw Jesus,
yeah,
and Buddhists will say they saw the Buddha. There's a Zuni example where he saw Kachina. So, yeah, and I mentioned, in the uh, Egyptian afterlife
mm,
texts, they meet the sun god Re. The very first, what might be the very first historical example of an NDE, is from ancient Sumer, and that's about the king Bilgamesh, who was actually the Sumerian name for Gilgamesh,
okay,
the Epic of Gilgamesh, and he's, in fact, that's an interesting example of the kind of similarity and difference thing. He's lying on his deathbed, and his soul travels to the other world, and he meets a being of light, and this time it's the sun god Utu, which the Sumerian sun god. And then he also encounters a panel of deities who are judges, and they also radiate light, and they evaluate his deeds on earth. And rather than things like, again, even that's culturally determined. So rather than things like, I don't know, whatever we would consider to be positive or negative behavior, in his case, because he's a king from 2000 BCE, it's things like, did you perform your rituals correctly? Did you build new temples? Um, were you a good ruler, and that sort of thing. And he passes the test, and so they decide that in the future, when he actually does die, after he comes back to his body and then eventually dies permanently, he'll be made a judge in the other world. So he will sit among the judges and will become half
Okay.
divine. So it's this transcendent kind of thing where he's becoming this kind of divinized spirit in the other world. He also meets his deceased relatives, and then there's
Right.
a feast, a banquet thrown in his honor,
Mm.
and then he comes back to his body, and then he's able to prepare his tomb and his funeral. So,
Mm.
um, yeah, it's all these kind of intertwined similarities and
Yeah.
differences, that, and it's another sort of methodological way I started looking at it was this idea of um, thematic structural similarity, and then the themes that make up that structure. So if the structure is the near-death experience story itself, it's made up of these themes of leaving the body, entering darkness, meeting deceased relatives, and then the way each of those themes are expressed is dependent on the individual and their culture on the symbolic level.
Yeah, that's that I think that tracks. You look at kind of so many different things, like even in terms of paranormal experiences, they can be very locally specific.
Mhm.
Like I think I've spoken about on this show before, but the whole thing between kind of say like Arabian jinn and Irish fairies, they behave
Mhm.
very similarly, but there
Yeah.
are very kind of local flavors. It's the same with kind of um it's kind of the Indian equivalent, or they're very similar. A lot
Yeah,
of
there's a
people think
great
of
example of that too in sleep paralysis,
right. Okay,
where if you know the work of David Hufford, he's a
no, I don't.
sociologist.
No.
He wrote a book in 1982, I think, called "The Terror That Comes in the Night," about sleep paralysis, and it's this phenomena that happens when you're in a hypnagogic state. They call it.
Right.
It's like that borderline between sleeping and awake,
Mhm.
either when you're falling asleep or just waking up. And this phenomena happens cross culturally that the person feels like there's a heavy weight pressing down on the chest.
Yeah.
They're immobilized. They can't speak or move. They can't call out for help.
Mhm.
And there's also this kind of malevolent presence in the
Mhm.
room, either holding them down or somewhere in the vicinity. And what distinguishes it from a dream, for one thing, it's reality. It just seems completely real. The person's not in any doubt. So it's a form of lucid dream, but you can't
Mhm.
control it. And it also takes place in the place where you are actually sleeping to make it even more real. It's not like it's
Mhm.
some dream world, and people are totally convinced when they have it. But so David Hufford found not only does this occur cross culturally, but that the malevolent presence in the room is given specifically cultural identities. So
Mhm.
in Newfoundland they call it an old hag, and in China they call it hungry ghost or whatever it is. And
Yeah.
he I was able to identify it. It's different meaning in each culture, but nevertheless it was still a seemingly paranormal experience leading to new beliefs in the spiritual.
Yeah. 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 I can imagine. I'm just where we get the word nightmare from.
Yeah,
Like yeah.
exactly.
Um. I kind of a more modern versions of that I've seen is you get the idea of like the Hat Man. You get the similar kind of like pressure on the body, the weight in the body, but there's like a dark figure in the corner of the room, and like
Hmm.
and seems to present with a hat.
Yeah.
That's quite a distinct motif that's come up in the last kind of couple of decades.
Uh,
Um, in terms of like you've got an array of different cultures. We touched on the kind of modern Western perception, and kind of I thought one of the big, I think, ideological differences is that reincarnation isn't a prevalent idea within Christianity, or Christ more broadly, kind of Christian Judeo-Christian culture. Um, some of the civilizations that you've explored, it absolutely is a prevalent idea. Um,
mhm.
where did you see kind of that manifest or take you on different turns?
Mostly in India, unsurprisingly.
Yeah.
Um, but it's interesting in India because reincarnation seems to be absent in the earliest texts, like the Rig Veda and Atharva Veda, and um, there are a few references to rebirth, but it's probably talking about rebirth in the other world into a new state
Right.
of being.
Okay.
Um, and we do have this. There's evidence for near-death experience in a text called the Atharva Veda, which is like a kind of um, magical medical text, and it describes people who travel to the other world when they're on the point of death and how to bring them back. So obviously they were aware of the phenomenon.
Right.
Um, and then we have this kind of strand of stories about a little boy being killed by his father and going to the other world and having different experiences and learning about death and the afterlife and then coming back to the body. That's in a kind of mythological way that it's presented, and it seems to be the same story morphing over hundreds of years. And then there are a couple of other similar type afterlife journey stories. But what's interesting about India is around the time of the Upanishads, when and this is maybe 800 BCE, 500 BCE, um, when the idea of reincarnation starts being introduced, those kind of stories taper off and they
Right.
become less common. The texts become kind of less ritually focused, even though the Rig Veda is still used as a ritual text. The preoccupation seems to be um, less with ritual, less with afterlife journeys, and more about the intermediate state and kind of negotiating the other world prior to your rebirth in a new body. So I don't think it's that they weren't having near death experiences anymore. I think just that the focus of the text became preoccupation with a positive rebirth, or even eventually overcoming the cycle of rebirth altogether.
Okay. So is that kind of instructional of this is how you behave to get away from samsara or that kind of thing?
Yeah, less about behavior and more about what you're going to encounter in the next world
Gotcha.
and the role of that your consciousness is playing, to use contemporary
Yeah.
terms,
Yeah.
in manifesting the reality of that other world and how to overcome it, how to recognize things, um, and then also just kind of the glories of what you're going to experience, descriptions of
Wow.
this transcendent state of wandering like a swan through the universe,
Yeah.
really kind of mystical, magical descriptions.
Wow.
Yeah.
Fabulous.
And that's similar actually in China too, with a text called the Shuangzi, which used to be transliterated as Chengsu. It's a very kind of mystical text about the wanderings of the soul, which some scholars think is rooted in shamanism, but I think there's probably also an NDE element in it as
Okay.
well, especially if shamanism is intended to do things like bring the soul back to the body, which is
Mm,
essentially rescuing near-death experiencers. So I think
yeah.
there's definitely a connection there.
That's interesting. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so in the evidence for the ancient civilizations for shamanism is a little sketchy. There seems to be in Vedic India, there are these um, they refer to these, long hair ascetic individuals who have these kinds of experiences,
Hmm.
and ingesting soma, which is some kind of unknown
Yeah.
substance that causes these visions. So there's definitely a relationship there. Even in Sumer, there's these particular individuals that are described as, again, having kind of long hair and shaking in ecstasy. And
Mm,
in China, there were these kind of traditions, especially in some of the poetry, where they talk about, um, ascending to heaven on dragons and going to worlds of jewels and going to undersea world of shells and really kind of psychedelic types of
wow.
descriptions. But there's not really clear evidence of that relationship between NDEs and shamanism until, well, basically until the small scale societies I was looking at. That's when I think
Right.
that the clearest evidence comes out, and that's in the form of things like the Native American ghost dance, Indian Shaker Church, the Dreamer religion. These are Native American religions that came up in mostly in the 19th century, and they're overtly based on the near death experiences of their founding prophets. Um, so a lot of people hear about the ghost dance and everything, but that element is for some reason has been left out
Right.
throughout the decades. So so these prophets would have these NDEs, and again, in a death and afterlife context, they died, came back to life, and then they would come back and say, I've been to this other world, and this is what the spirits told me, and they want me to share accessibility to this kind of experience to everybody in the community. So they would develop these technologies, for lack of a better word,
Yeah.
of accessing the other world without having to die, without being physically compromised. And so that resulted in these ritual activities of, drumming and dancing and chanting and probably drug taking
Yeah.
repeatedly until they collapse and have these out of body journeys to other worlds. And it's all done with the intention of having that experience. So it's got the seed is planted and then
Yeah,
and
sure.
then it's fulfilled.
Wow, I did not know that. That's so interesting. And to wrap up is like, what's next for you? I mean, I always feel it's slightly kind of like, I'm promoting my book. What do you mean? What's next?
Yeah.
Let me get this one out the door. But is there kind of another piece of work that you got your eye on, or is formulating?
Yeah, strangely enough. I'm working now on rather than a big cross-cultural NDE
Yeah.
comparison, I'm kind of zeroing in on near-death experience in Greece and Rome, ancient Greece and
Okay.
Rome, and trying to look at the different manifestations of them. So partly the ways they were discussed by different philosophers,
Mhm.
because some people believed them and held them up as examples of proof of life after death. Some thought they were ridiculous and ridiculed them. But then they were also seemed to be incorporated into ancient mystery cults
Right.
in the same way that they were in shamanism. This kind of reenactment of the experience in order to have ensure a positive afterlife. So yeah, that's a long-term project. That won't be out. The book won't be out for 2 or 3 years probably.
Right. Okay. Cool. Cool.
Yeah.
Well, fantastic. Thank you. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.
Yeah. Thanks. You too.
Wonderful stuff. I hope you all got something from that. If you'd like to know more, then do check the show notes for links to more of Dr. Shushan's work and links to where you can pick up the book. I love that kind of juxtaposition of history, religion, and spirituality. It's just so engaging, so interesting. Right, I'm going to leave it there. I'm Darren Mason, and you've been listening to Spirit Box. Take care. Talk soon. Bye.